Good morning, everybody. We should start shortly. Please take your seats. So please take your seats. We'll start soon. So we will start in 30 seconds. Please take your seats. So good morning, everybody. I would like to welcome you to this plenary on Indigenous lead conservation. But before we start the event, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the issue that occurred last night, and that the Society of Conservation Biology North America and the Society of Conservation Biology extend its deep condolence to the family and friends of those who were affected last night. And we would like maybe to take a moment of silence in memory of the people that were having this not pleasant event last night. So let's have us all a moment of silence, please. So as we know more, we will inform you. At this point, we would like the director of the security of the hotel to take a few moments to remind you maybe some kind of security issue in the hotel and its vicinity. So please, Diane.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Weston Harbor Castle. My name is Diane Kostopoulos, and I'm the Director of Security here at the hotel. So my thoughts and prayers go out to everyone with the tragedy that happened on Danforth Avenue last night. So our safety is our #1 priority here at the Westin Harbor Castle Hotel, and we want to make sure that you guys feel safe when you're staying here with us. I have security on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In the event there is an emergency, we ask that there are house phones placed along the walls of the meeting space. So you just pick up the house phone and it will get in contact with our hotel operator, who will then reach the security team. Emergency exits, you'll see on my right and my left, you'll see just behind the curtains are emergency exits, and behind you guys, there are also emergency exits which will lead outside. Once you exit the doors to your right, you'll see the staircase that will lead you right out to the back, and then the Lakeview Terrace that I'm pretty sure you guys all noticed right now, they will also lead you right down to the outside. We just want to make sure that, we have a lot of associates walking around, so if you see something, say something. If you feel that something is not right, just approach any associate. We all have our name tags on our right side. We have a name tag in the Westin Pride pin right above, so just reach out and say something. Thank you.
So now we are ready to open the session, and I would like to ask Dr. Deborah Luke to introduce and open the session. She's the Executive Director of the Society of Conservation Biology.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is going to be a really busy week. We've got a lot planned. Your planners for this conference, Jessa, Jamie, the local organizing committee, everybody that's been working so hard, really deserve your kudos. So make sure when you see them that you thank them. It's just starting, so you're gonna have a lot of thanks to give them by the end of the week, so we've got a lot planned for you. So we have spent 3 days before this meeting with the board of directors working really hard for you, for the society. I would like to have Mike Mesha, Dr. Mesha, stand up. He is our president of our board. I want you to see his face. He's going to be here all week. Do we have other board members in the audience right now? If I do, can you please stand up? Anywhere? Over here? There's one back here. There's some back there. Look around, look on tags, look for people's names. Part of being here this week is networking and having the opportunity to meet people that you can work with, that you can partner with, that you might be able to get involved further within the society and our committees and other areas. So I really encourage you to take advantage of meeting with Mike, other board members, talking to them, picking their brains on how you can get involved to help make the society stronger and more impactful. So I'm just going to talk to you about a couple of things, if I can, maybe, there we go. A couple of updates, very short updates, just to give you a little bit of an idea of some of the things we've been working on in the last year, and member benefits. So this has been a busy year. 2018 is really busy. As you know, SCB has 7 different sections across the globe, and 6 of them have had regional congresses this year. So you're currently at the North America Congress, but we've been really busy all across the globe, which is really exciting. We have a variety of new member benefits that are just being launched right now. You've all probably seen the online communities. If you haven't, I suggest you go online as an SCB member, log in, enter your information, and they're really becoming quite dynamic. We really need your input for more communication between yourself and other members. But we'll be having different online communities for every section, every working group, every chapter, and special interests. So it's going to be quite interesting. We also have our membership directory. So you have the option to include information about yourself. You can opt out as a member, but it's a really nice way where you can go in and search for other people that might be SCB members that you're looking for. So you can pull up and see the biography. Of course, you can opt out not to include this information if you so desire. But then we also have an expertise database now where you can do a search for different fields, different expertise areas. If you're looking to link with other researchers or scientists or academics that are in your field or you're interested in pursuing, you can do searches now for this. Of course, that only works if you update your member information so people can find you. Of course, we have the Career Center that has been there, but we've added some new benefits to that, so look at that. And as I said, our membership directory and expertise database, you can really connect with others that way. This I'm really excited about also. So you know that the Society for Conservation Biology has 2 journals, Conservation Biology itself and Conservation Letters. We are really excited to launch a 3rd journal, Conservation Science and Practice. And it is live now. You can upload articles that you're interested in publishing, and we would love to have our members be the first to publish in the first issue that comes out in January. So Dr. Mark Schwartz is our new editor-in-chief. He is here. He will be, are you in the audience, Mark? Somewhere? Maybe? Okay, well, he will be here this week. So I encourage you to go to the NACCB booth, where you can learn more about all of these benefits. We can help you learn how to coordinate them. You can learn more about the journal itself and how to become involved and pursue that. And then, of course, the last thing I want to invite you to is next year. This year we have all of our regional congresses. Like I said, next year we have our big international congress. And that will be held in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. And we just did a site visit. It's going to be a really exciting place to visit. Really great opportunities there. So I hope you can all join us. And if you're not an NACCB member, this is my plug for you to become an NACCB member. As you see, we have a lot of new benefits that are starting. We're going to be working on a lot of new things for all of you. This is, or could be, if you're not already a member, your professional society. We can make it whatever you want it to be. I'm excited to be here. I've been here for a year now. And so I really would love to hear from each and every one of you on what your needs are, what you're thinking. Please don't hesitate to contact me or reach out to me at any point. So, that's all I really wanted to say to you. Just give you that little bit of an update, but it is actually my pleasure now to introduce you to the moderator for our plenary this morning. Dr. Cheryl Hetkevich is moderating, did I get it? Yes. Oh, yay, okay. Is moderating the Indigenous-led Conservation Plenary this morning. Cheryl is a conservation scientist with WCS Canada, where she focuses on wildlife research and monitoring as it relates to the cumulative impacts of land use and climate change, and she focuses on the community and regional scale in Ontario's far north. So I would like to introduce Cheryl. You want to come up here? And she's going to be your moderator for this morning. Thank you, Cheryl.
I'm actually going to invite my plenary members to come up as well, please. So thank you, Elder Gary Sue, for welcoming us to the territory yesterday. And I also want to acknowledge that we're on the gathering place of many nations, including Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And acknowledge we're meeting in the area covered by Treaty 13, also known as the Toronto Purchase, and pay my respects to the Mississaugas of the Credit. As Dr. Luke announced, my name is Cheryl. I'm a conservation scientist with WCS Canada, and I'm really honored today to be here to bring the voices of other Indigenous peoples to this conference and to have them share their perspectives, learnings, and teachings about conservation, and hopefully some teachings around how we take care of ourselves and the non-human relations that we all care about in this room. By way of logistics, I'll just introduce our panel briefly and then invite you to read the full bios for our panel members as well. Before we get started, though, some of you might have seen that there was a smudging ceremony happening, and I'll just invite Eli to give a few words about what that was all about.
Oops, thanks, Cheryl. So the smudge is an important part of protocol for Indigenous peoples in various parts of Turtle Island, North America, and it's it's been likened to the equivalent of the gavel of the starting of a meeting. And it's just a formal protocol to get us started in a good way. And particularly this, the medicine used in this smudge is special for us because it was used in the opening ceremony in June of last year, and the beginning of the Pathway to Canada Target 1, and the first meeting of the National Advisory Panel, and the National Steering Committee, and the Indigenous Circle of Experts all came together in Ottawa, and Elder Larry McDermott here often refers to that ceremony, and since then, and just the significance that having all of those government staff participate in the pipe ceremony, and Catherine McKenna, Minister McKenna also participated. And it harkens back to an age in Canada and in North America generally where there was more cross-cultural literacy, and Larry spoke to that a little bit last night. So that's the significance of this particular medicine that was used here. It was used in the opening ceremony and the commencement ceremony when we handed our reports over to the ministers and transferred responsibility back to the government. So, thank you.
Thank you, Eli. And I just also wanted to acknowledge Sam Hester over on the other stage. Sam is visually recording our presentation and the conversations that she hears today, and her work will be displayed throughout the conference, and welcome you to take a look at that and see how we've captured the conversations, another way to think about communications around science. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Eli Enns. Eli is Nuu-chah-nulth First Nation and a political scientist from the traditional territories of the Colloquiet peoples of Western Vancouver Island. He's the co-chair of the Indigenous Circle of Experts, a research associate with the Polis Project on Ecological Governance at the University of Victoria, and the regional coordinator for the Indigenous and Community Conserved Areas, or ICCA's, consortium here in North America. Thank you, Eli.
Thanks again, Cheryl. Like tossing it back and forth here. So I want to start my presentation with a concept in the Nuu-chah-nulth language. Cheryl mentioned that, on my father's side of my family, I'm from Tla'ukwit on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and we're Nuu-chah-nulth peoples there. We're, traditionally whale hunters. Very much the culture is on the ocean, and, the ancient cedar rainforest. And in my territory, we still have quite a bit of intact, old-growth, ancient cedar rainforest, and that was because of some activities of our nation over the past 34 years that I'll speak to throughout my talk. But I want to start with a worldview concept of Nuu-chah-nulth peoples that relates to the subject of conservation biology. That concept is Hishuk Ish Tsawak. Hishuk Ish Tsawak. Yeah, thanks. I got a bit of a cold, so fighting that off. In the fall of 2015, I had the opportunity to be invited, actually by your husband, Cheryl Gleb, to the Indigenous Terra Madre, which was a slow food movement gathering in Meghalaya in Shillong in northeast India. And Frang Roy was sort of the driving force behind this gathering. It was a very large gathering. They actually constructed a new highway for the gathering in these rural areas of northeast India. Very beautiful. People still maintaining their traditional agricultural practices, their traditional sort of artisanal mining, hand sort of sourcing materials from the land. And this was sort of the indigenous response to Terra Madre, the slow food movement generally, which emerged from Italy and other places in the world. The keynote speaker for that event was a surprise to many of us. It was Prince Charles from the royal family, addressing, over 600 Indigenous delegates from all over the world, many of whom had been impacted by, British colonial legacies and, a lot of bad news bears that emerged from that. It was a surprise, and there was actually some people who were sort of saying we should do a big mass walkout when this guy starts speaking. But I'm glad we didn't, because his address was quite insightful. And what he argued and what he elaborated on in his address was that the extinction event isn't the problem facing planet Earth. It's not overpopulation, it's not pollution, it's not industrialization. Those are all symptoms. Those are all symptoms of a root problem. And the root problem that Prince Charles described was a worldview of disconnectedness, an internal disconnectedness that manifests from that inner world dysfunctionality and disease. When our inner world is disconnected and dysfunctional, the things we think, the things we say, the actions that flow from our inner worlds are also dysfunctional and disconnected. And so I thought that was very insightful. And the title of my talk for that day was Hishuk Ish Tsawak. And in concluding his remarks, Prince Charles turned to the Indigenous delegates and he said, "But it's you Indigenous peoples who've always understood and still understand that everything is one and everything is interconnected." So, and with tongue-in-cheek, he said, "Can you now solve all the problems that we've created?" And so, in my presentation, Hishuk Ish Tsawak, in our language, in the Nuu-chah-nulth language, means everything is one and everything is interconnected in a very loose translation. But it describes the interconnection both physically and spiritually of all things in this world. Look at Opitsat on Mears Island, the Mears Island Tribal Park, where my late father grew up in a 10,000-year-old village. He was born in the 50s, and throughout his childhood, there was no running water and there was no electricity in that village. And that's the way it was supposed to be. The old people say as soon as we got electricity, people started to get lazy. And when the engineers came to build the first water treatment plant in our village, they had to explain themselves to the elders in the village. And they explained that there are small invisible creatures in the water, and we have to kill those things so you can drink the water. And the elders were horrified by that. They weren't horrified by the idea that there were small invisible creatures in the water. They knew that very well. They were horrified that these engineers wanted to sterilize and kill those microorganisms. Hishuk Ish Tsawak means that I have to maintain ceremoniously a relationship between the microorganisms of my body and the microorganisms of my environment. We have to maintain that interconnection and relationship. Usimsh is a traditional ceremonial bathing exercise that is still done today. And when you usimsh, you actively meditate on that interconnection and you foster those relationships with your environment. And if done regularly and done well, you can maintain a healthy balance of microorganisms between your body and the environment, which essentially enables what I would term a super immune system that allows you to engage with the environment and adapt to changing microorganisms and diseases that might come into the environment and so on and so forth. So this is a very brief introduction to Hishuk Ish Tsawak. The next thing that I'd like to share with folks here is, we have this extinction event, the 6th largest extinction event in the known archaeological record of the planet. One of my volunteer engagements is with an organization called the ICCA Consortium, Indigenous Peoples and Community Conserved Territories and Areas. The ICCA Consortium is a global organization that works to support Indigenous-led conservation globally as well as community-led conservation. The simple premise being that it's those who have evolved and who have lived in a particular watershed or in a particular environment for many millennia are best suited to perform conservation activities, who understand the relationship and the interconnection of various physical processes and species in that environment. And so, although there is an extinction event happening globally, there are islands of intact, thriving biodiversity. And the research is fairly conclusive that nearly 99% of the time, where you find those islands of thriving biodiversity that's resisting, that's enduring, and being resilient to the extinction event, we also find islands of intact, thriving cultural and linguistic diversity. Cultures and languages are going extinct on this planet at a similar rate as organisms, biology, So the interconnection between cultural and linguistic diversity and biological diversity is undeniable. So if you want to foster and maintain healthy, abundant biodiversity, look to the cultures and the languages of the people who've been interacting with those systems for millennia. And so that, that's one kind of thing for the conservation biology to look at that. And what are we heard about two-eyed seeing yesterday, and what do Indigenous knowledge systems and Western science equally have to contribute towards addressing these big shared problems that we have. And is that my time now, Cheryl? No? Okay, a little bit longer. So to kind of conclude here, I'll share a little bit about tribal parks. I was really pleased to hear in the opening comments yesterday, the lady mentioned tribal parks. And that's quite a fairly new thing for us, to have it identified and recognized in these kinds of settings. Tribal parks originally, in the 34 years ago, tribal parks were done on the blockades, literally. Blockading industrial forestry on Mears Island. The first tribal park was declared by my Uncle Moses Martin, who was our elected chief at the time and still is today. Glad to say he's still alive and leading us. And it took both the local community and the Indigenous nation to protect Mears Island working together around shared values of social and environmental justice. One of the staff of Macmillan Bloedel, which is the big logging company, he got access to information about the logging plans of Macmillan Bloedel to log 90% of Mears Island. And he was so disturbed by that he stole information from the company, and he went AWOL, and he brought that information to our chiefs and to our community, to our nation. And when Moses learned of the full plan of Macmillan Bloedel and the implication of that, he was fearful, and he was deeply disturbed. And in our teachings, it's important to experience those emotions, but not to get stuck and not to act from those emotions. Those emotions are important indicators for you to understand your inner world and also your relationships with other people and other things in the environment. So what Moses did with that emotion is he went and he did prayer and meditation on our laws, the Nuchanoth laws. Hishakish Tsawak is a worldview concept. The highest law in our Constitution is Isak, which means respect, or to observe, appreciate, and act accordingly. And it's represented in our totem pole as a sun or moon crest, which are the big governors of our economy, of our bioregional economies. And so after many days of prayer and meditation on Isak, Moses came to the realization that he had to go and start preparing a meal. In Nuchanoth culture, cross-cultural understanding is built over meals. Family disputes, everything was done through a ceremonious coming together of having a meal together. And so he wanted to go and prepare a meal for the loggers. He knew, because he had access to the drawings, he knew where they would be landing to begin road construction for the clear-cut logging of Mears Island. And he went there along with our relatives and other supporters to start preparing a meal. And in his meditations on Isak, he realized that these are not bad people who are coming to log the island. These are fathers and sons and brothers, uncles, people who are providing for their families and who are operating under a misunderstanding. The misunderstanding was that Mears Island was tree farm license 54 or 47. And he wanted to go and educate them. So in Nuchanoth, we educate through the meal, educate the body and the mind. And so when the loggers eventually did come, they were prepared. They had built a small house where the road was to be built. They were doing traditional dugout canoes on the beach, and they had a meal ready to go for the loggers, their welcoming party. And so when they came, Moses met them at Tsisakis, which is Heelboom Bay, and he welcomed them ashore and he said, we'd like you to join us for a meal, but you have to leave your chainsaws in the boat. This is not a tree farm. This is Wana Jas Hilthuis. This is our garden. This is a tribal park. And what Moses was attempting to do in a very small way is to establish cross-cultural literacy, cross-cultural understanding. He first explained that they were misinformed. This is not a tree farm. This is Wana Jas Hilthuis. But he knew that they wouldn't be able to understand what those words meant, so he tried to convey the spirit of it by making a biblical reference first. It's our Garden of Eden. It's that sacred. This is not an industrial work site. This is a sacred place, Wana Jas Hilthuis. And for those who aren't Christians, and just to nail the point home, he said this is a tribal park. And at the time, if you asked what the definition of a tribal park was, the simple definition is the tribal park is not a tree farm. And that's an entry point, and I'm glad Dr. Nancy Turner's here because the work that she's been doing over the last many years has built more cross-cultural understanding through disciplines like ethnobiology and ethnobotany and finding new terminology in the English language to continue to bridge that cross-cultural divide. And so I think I am at my time count now. And so I'll conclude just by saying that in regards to conservation biology, we look forward to continuing to create that cross-cultural literacy. Miigwech kleko kleko.
Thanks, Eli. And I'm going to let everybody speak, and then there'll be some time for some questions at the end of that. So our next speaker is Danica Billy Littlechild. Danica is a Cree lawyer from Mesquassis. Sorry, you'll have to fix that. Treaty Number 6, territory in Alberta. With Eli, she was the co-chair of the Indigenous Circle of Experts and a consulting legal counsel for the International Indian Treaty Council. And she's going to talk to us today about the process. Thank you.
Hi, Cheryl. Danza doya kakeo kananaskum danawa ota bentumiek. I want to thank the Indigenous peoples on whose territory we stand and discuss conservation and protection with each other today. I want to thank Elder Larry McDermott for letting our smudge and all of you for being here to listen with open hearts and open mind. And for the Cree, when we tell our children to listen, we don't just mean with your ears, we mean with your entire being, to open yourself up to all of the information and messages and feeling and emotion that comes with the words that you hear. And I think that that's part of why we wanted the smudge in the room and why I actually requested for the smudge to be in the room, because the smudge also helps us to do that. And it's a sacred symbol and an entry point for us to be together in spirit. And one of the things that our elders often tell us is when we go and we share something significant of ourselves, we should always call our spirits back when we continue on our journey to make sure that we don't leave a part of ourselves that we share so significantly with other people. So I hope that the smudge helps you today. If anyone here is having any struggles or challenges, that this smudge will bless you and help you. And certainly the medicine that we used was used at the inaugural ceremony for the work of the Indigenous Circle of Experts. We began in ceremony because we took seriously the elevation of Indigenous peoples' knowledge systems and ways of being. So we didn't just want to talk about that as sort of a subject, but we wanted to action it as a reality. And so I think that that's one of our main goals in continuing this work in ceremony, to bring ceremony into spaces like this, is a way of actioning what we talk about in our final report, We Rise Together. So I want to just tell you a little bit about the Indigenous Circle of Experts. One of the things that we're going to do is we have 4 hard copies of our beautiful report, which we are going to submit to this conference's, I believe they asked everyone to bring something for an auction. So we're going to submit those. So if anyone wants, really desperately wants a hard copy, you can go and do a bid for it. And benefit organization at the same time. And so all the information I'm giving you is available in the report, and the report is also downloadable online. So the Indigenous Circle of Experts was a body that was convened under the Pathway to Canada Target 1 initiative, which was intended for Canada to meet its international obligations under the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Aichi targets, which were set in 2010. Target 11 of the Aichi targets talked about the state party sort of increasing protected and conserved areas to 17% by the year 2020. And so Canada started getting its act together last year and put the Pathway Initiative together. And sort of the Indigenous Circle of Experts was sort of tasked with providing some guidance and advice on how that could be accomplished in the context of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous territories. And of course, that wasn't asking too much, because we don't actually, being sarcastic a little bit, but, we had to deal with major issues in the context of our work, right? Like what we talk about in our report is the dark histories of protection and conservation when it comes to Indigenous peoples. And that's not just true of Canada, it's true of all regions of the world where Indigenous peoples are found and where conservation has essentially displaced Indigenous peoples from their traditional territories and from their lifeways. And so when the ICE was convened, initially under the leadership of Eli Enns, and then bringing me into it at a later date as the co-chair, we had 20 members of our committee. Around half of those were Indigenous experts from across the country, and then the other half were people who represented different governments like BC and other provinces and territories, and all of us sort of came together to try to meet the challenge of not just the terms of reference for our work within the context of the Pathway Initiative, but also with the obligations that we set for ourselves by convening our work in ceremony. So there's something to understand there about the interaction and the elaboration of two different knowledge systems, right? You have the written system, which gives you the mandate in the written form, whether that's through the Aichi targets, the text of the convention, Canada's stated obligations, and then also those that are found through Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous worldviews, which you heard Eli describe for you a little bit. And so those obligations, while they're not on paper, may be slightly even more binding because there's something that you carry with you all the time, and that you are always sort of accountable to, no matter where you might be. And so when we convened the ICE, we actually had to, just within our own committee, go through the process of, slogging it through the weeds together to try to understand how to articulate, first of all, the lived realities and the history of conservation and protection in Canada vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples, and then also try to elaborate a new path forward and a transformative moment, which is kind of hard to describe. It took all of us together working with elders, and what was really fundamental to our work was actually the 4 gatherings that we held across Canada, convening different Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples as experts to advise us on how to accomplish our work as well. And something to know about those gatherings is we brought ceremony to those gatherings as well. We had ceremony as aspects of almost every gathering and work session that we conducted. So how did we try to describe this paradigm shift? We suggested that the status quo ought not to continue. And I know that there are many, many wonderful organizations, non-Indigenous organizations out there who have begun already to engage with Indigenous peoples and who have different methodologies that they're using and different approaches. And I think what is different about our advice is that we propose that Indigenous peoples actually take the lead going forward, that Indigenous peoples be identified as new partners, that Indigenous peoples identify their allies, that new champions are identified, so that Indigenous peoples are not just seen as sort of the passive beneficiaries or the passive clients or the passive recipients, so that Indigenous peoples and their knowledge systems are actually elevated to the place where they are respected just as somebody would be who had a PhD or who had, different elements of legitimacy from the mainstream forum. And so, this paradigm shift is also sort of about reconceptualizing how we understand each other in basic relations. And something you'll see in the report is this concept of ethical space. This was really our main methodology when we talked about this paradigm shift. And this was brought to us by Elder Reg Kirshew from Treaty 7 territory out west. And he talked about ethical space being something that tried to elaborate the new landscape, the new context within which our relations ought to move forward. And really, it does a great job of describing how to elevate Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous peoples and their rights. So ethical space says that there's a new framework. The pre-existing framework was one which was captured, say, by the Canadian Constitution, Section 35, talking about, existing treaty and Aboriginal rights, 9124, talking about sort of jurisdictional issues around Indians and lands reserved for Indians, and Canadian jurisprudence, of course. And one of the things that you should know, and something that I'm often asked actually by NGOs, is how come it always has to be about law? And how come law always has to come into the picture? And that's mainly because law governs almost our entire lives. I sometimes jokingly say that law governs who we get to date, because who I date and have children with determines the status of my children. There's no other ethnic group in Canada whose legal recognition is determined by a regulation of their own identity and their children's identity. And so law is really like our daily lived reality. I mean, I heard about treaty at the kitchen table from the earliest memory I can remember, that was foundational to my understanding of our relations with non-Indigenous peoples. And so that's why law. And we weren't the ones who set that in motion. It was the Settler Society who set that in motion. But we now have these treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements between us and that Settler Society, and including Canada and the provinces as successor states and territories. And ethical space is not just framed by that long history, but it's also framed now by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada calls to action, as well as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which, by the way, sets out, in the text of the UN Declaration, sets out the minimum standard of rights of Indigenous peoples. So it's the floor, not the ceiling. That's something to think about when you read the UN Declaration. These are minimum standards. It's not an aspirational document. This is the United Nations saying these are the minimum rights to be held by Indigenous peoples the world over. These are not sort of things to aspire to. Maybe one day we'll get there. These are the minimum rights to be expected by Indigenous peoples, and we now have legislation in Canada, which was put forward by Romeo Saganish, which was passed, I believe, third reading in the House, and which establishes the United Nations Declaration in Canada as legislation, which is very significant. So that even solidifies even more the ethical space framework. How am I doing for time? Okay. So if you think about this ethical space, the proposal of this framework that we now have, TRC, UN DEC, Canadian Constitution, jurisprudence, all of these things which frame now how the written system, so the mainstream system, whoever that might be, and the oral systems of Indigenous peoples knowledge systems on the other side, it's a window where we can move together to dialogue so that we can have ethical interactions, right? So if we all accept this framework, then we have to be critical thinkers about it. Like, we're not providing you guys with an easy peasy formula. This is actually asking you to do a lot of work. It's asking you to understand that framework for yourselves, for the context of the work that you do, and then consequently to engage with Indigenous folks within that framework with your critical thinking cap on and trying to understand how to engage then in ethical interactions that establish Indigenous peoples as partners and not passive sort of people in the landscape that are just part of the landscape, Funnily enough, that's how we were in the very beginning when the settlers first came here. They were like, oh, there's the rock and the tree and the Indian, let's settle, it's empty land. And in fact, I think they still, till recently, even in Australia, Indigenous peoples there were under the Flora and Fauna Act, if you can believe it. And so what do we mean by paradigm shift then? Like, why were we so passionate about this paradigm shift in ethical space? Because we wanted to go beyond dialogue. So this is not just about coming to conferences and talking about it. What we really want you guys to do is to take our 28 recommendations, look at them, think about ethical space, and consider how to contribute to systems change when it comes to Indigenous peoples and conservation. What does that mean from your perspective? You guys are all experts too, which I totally respect. And I think you all have amazing collective knowledge to bring to bear in this collective challenge that we face. This is not something that is necessarily going to be solved by Indigenous peoples. It has to be solved by all of us working together collaboratively and ethically. And we can't just have more studies. You know, I don't know if you guys have heard of this Walking Eagle news, but in November of 2017, they released a press release saying a 7-year study suggests that Indigenous peoples are often studied. And of course, like, you know, it's like The Onion, like, you know, so it's supposed to be funny, but it was so true. And like all the Indigenous people on my Twitter feed and on Facebook were like, oh my gosh, retweet. It's hilarious. We used to say in Musqueam, where I'm from, that you weren't a complete family if you didn't have an ethnologist in the family. And in fact, we had one in ours, I'm very proud to say, Morgan Bayagiran, who was formerly at what was formerly known as the Museum of, well, now it's the Museum of Canadian History in Ottawa. And at one point, he was like, hey, because my middle name is Billy, everyone in the family calls me Billy. He's like, hey, Billy, can I have your teddy bear? I want to put it in the museum and have it in like a case saying like Cree Girl Teddy Bear. And I was like, absolutely not, you can't have Charlie. So, you know, like he was collecting from everywhere. So anyway, we don't want any more studies, guys. We don't need any more experts about us. We'd like to actually be the experts of ourselves now. You know, we'd actually like to be recognized as holders of Indigenous knowledge that don't need a PhD student to translate our knowledge, that we can actually translate that ourselves. Yeah. So, and part of the paradigm shift is dedicating the time and resources. Like, this is not going to be easy, but it is actually something fairly simple. So there's a difference between simple and easy, and I wish that weren't the case with exercising and diet, but unfortunately it is. So simple in the sense that it requires some pretty straightforward actions on the part of our non-Indigenous friends to inform yourselves of the territory in which you reside, to inform yourself on the territories in which you do your work, to engage with Indigenous peoples, not in a way that sort of makes them subjects of the engagement, but where you actually maybe make friends and learn about the people that you want to work with and make them equal partners, or sort of step aside and make some room for them to take the lead. It's about supporting Indigenous funding models. It's about creating new resources for the new designation that we described in our report called Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas. And so just to conclude, I want to talk a little bit about IPCAs. So when we began sort of putting together our advice and started writing these recommendations, the real pillar of our work was this emergent designation, Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas. And even though this concept had been described in other areas, other fora, like I think in ICCAs, as well as, in tribal parks, et cetera, we actually had to sort of articulate something slightly different and more nuanced because, of course, we were in the context of this Pathway to Canada Target 1 initiative where we had very specific requirements in terms of what we had to put together in the form of advice for the co-lead ministers, Minister McKenna and Minister Phillips, who is the Minister of Environment and Parks in Alberta. And so when we went through the process of elaborating the concept of IPCAs, what we really tried to do was to integrate this concept of elevating Indigenous peoples, Indigenous knowledge systems, and this concept of ethical space. And so what we tried to do in our report was to be extremely descriptive, but not prescriptive. So the difference being that we wanted to throw the door wide open to Indigenous peoples to say who they were and to be their own experts, as I mentioned. And we also, though, wanted to satisfy the seemingly unlimited need for some type of formula or some type of structure, to help people to understand what IPCAs are. So we have some key descriptors in our report, including that IPCAs have to promote respect for Indigenous knowledge systems. And so respect is sort of beyond saying, okay, we're going to have a panel and Danica is going to do a PowerPoint on Indigenous knowledge systems and we've respected it. Actually, what it means is that it may require policy changes. It may require changes in processes, methodologies, engagements, all that kind of stuff. Respect means something quite deep and extensive in the way that we've chosen to describe it in our report. We also talk about respecting protocols and ceremony. So sometimes I go to meetings and we ask an elder to do a smudge, and then that's sort of the end of it, and people are like, oh, that was cool, there was a smudge. But people don't actually know what the real meaning of the smudge is. And so that may mean sort of maybe some education aspects of trying to get a minimal understanding of Indigenous knowledge systems, so you have some concept of what's going on when ceremonies and protocols are being used. To support the revitalization of Indigenous languages. I'm really thrilled that this government has committed to legislation to promote Indigenous language, but I don't think that legislation is ever enough. I mean, has legislation ever been enough in terms of protection of species at risk? No. So legislation is not enough. Like, this has to be something real on the ground with everybody involved. And so I think supporting the revitalization of Indigenous language means being comfortable with not knowing what somebody's saying in the meeting. And seeing if they can translate for themselves for you later, or find different ways of engaging translators. Sometimes in Musqueam, we have what we call treaty talks. We hire local people to do decree translations during those talks. There's always ways to ensure that Indigenous languages are being revitalized in your meetings and your gatherings. We also talk about seeding conservation economies, and that's something that Eli would be much better placed to speak to than I would. But I think, in terms of our other key point, which is conservation of cultural keystone species and protecting food security, for us, all of this sort of meshes together in the sense that Eli was talking about earlier about this concept of interconnectedness. We really understand everything as interconnected. And when we experience the collapse of our traditional economies, it's not just, oh, that's so sad, they can't have their country food. It's actually, really, it's the loss of stories, it's the loss of even aspects of language. Words in our language might be lost. Our collective memory bank is being, chipped away at with every loss that we experience. And it's been within our lifetime. I'm 43, and I remember when I was 5, going behind our house on the res, and my uncle would take me out walking from our house to my gukums to my grandmother's, and all along the way he could show me all the biodiversity, here's the fungus that we use for this medicine, here are all these different medicines that we can collect, here's the best berry bush on the way to gukums, all this stuff. Now there's literally crabgrass. All that biodiversity was lost within my lifetime on our reservation. And a lot of that was due to oil and gas development and extensive ag, with a lot of pesticides and herbicides that they never had to disclose to us because there were no regulations to say, yeah, we should tell the natives what we're spraying all over them and their kids. So, there's legislation that needs to change, yes, and I'm a lawyer and I'm all for that. I can talk about that till the cows come home. But what I'm interested in communicating to all of you is encourage you to be, as I said, critical thinkers in what kind of systems change you can engage in as an individual in the context of your lived reality. I wish you all the best in that. Hi.
Wow. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce our last speaker, Val Courtois, who is from Innu Nation, and she's a member of the community of Mastayashits on the shore of Lac Saint Jean. She's a registered professional forester and the director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, and she's going to talk to you now about that amazing initiative.
Thank you, Cheryl. And I don't normally come up to a podium with a computer, but you'll know why in a second. So as Cheryl said, I'm Valérie. I'm originally from Mastouillats, which is the westernmost Innu community in Quebec, but I live and work often with the easternmost Innu communities of Shehajit and Natwashish in Labrador. And so I live in Goose Bay. And it's a lovely place to live. A little quick note about the Indigenous Leadership Initiative. We're a relatively new group that really emerged out of the International Boreal Conservation Campaign, which has been around for the last 20 or so years, 18 years if you want to be a stickler about it. And really, we're a collection of leaders from across Turtle Island, Canada, who work together because strong nations make strong decisions on lands. And so Stephen Nita is here as one of our members. We've got a group of senior advisors that include Ovid Mercredi, former national chief, Stephen Kakfwi, former premier of the Northwest Territories, and Dene Leader. It includes Miles Richardson, who's the former leader of the Haida Nation, currently candidate for national chief. It includes as well Dave Porter, who is the CEO of the First Nations Energy and Mining Council and also former CEO of the First Nations Forestry Council in British Columbia and negotiated for his nation, the Kaska Nation, as well as Dave Corshane Jr. And Dave is a well-known elder who works out of the Turtle Lodge in Saguin, and Dave has really been brought on to be our spiritual advisor because, as Danica just explained, ceremony and everything makes a difference in how we operate and how we interact with each other, because you can imagine that personalities like Ovid Mercredi and Miles Richardson sometimes need some spiritual guidance to work through some of their issues. So at the initiative, we do everything from land use planning to supporting Indigenous protected and conserved areas or Indigenous protected areas to also working on issues like stewardship. So some of you may have heard of the Indigenous Guardians Network, which was announced in Budget 2017. So we're a group that works with folks on the ground on how to do this. At this point, I avoided doing the slideshow talk. We've got a session this afternoon that's co-moderated by Jeff Wells and I. You can come see it. I will do the formal slide, PowerPoint thing. But I thought for this morning, and because I'm distinctly aware that I'm between you and your lunch, that I would tell a story, and then I'll explain a little bit why this story matters, and I think it'll speak to both what Eli and Danica had to say, which I'm pleased about because it wasn't planned. So this is the story of the man who married a caribou. A man had a son and he didn't get any caribou. That night the boy dreamt in his sleep and he told his father about his dream. Now note, for us, dreams are particularly significant. And so and it might be for some of you too, but it's our way of connecting with the spiritual dimension. Daddy, I dreamt last night that a caribou girl wanted to marry me. The father could not tell his son what his dream was about. He said to him, since we never have any caribou, we can't even get to them. Maybe your dreams tells you what you might be able to get close to them. Yes, the boy said. Then he dressed up, put on his snowshoes, and left. It was a very nice day. He went straight to the hill not very far from the camp, and the sun was up. He went up a little further to see what was on the other side of the hill, and he stood there for a while, looking both ways. There were a few trees down below and a lake behind him. He saw something on the lake, and it looked like a caribou herd. He moved further ahead to make sure what was on the lake. As he came close, he was pretty sure it was a caribou herd, and finally he saw the tracks. So he went right to the end of the hill from where he could see all the way down, and the caribou herd was close to the shore of the lake where the trees were. He looked down the hill to the wooded area where he could get closer to the herd. As he walked down the hill, one of the caribou got up, walked past the other caribou, and headed towards the shore where he was. He couldn't see the caribou anymore once it reached the trees. He just sat there wondering what had happened to it. As he waited, he got ready with his bow and arrow. Once again, he saw the caribou heading his way. He wasn't sure if he would hit the caribou if it came closer. The caribou was still coming towards the tree where he was hiding. The boy had his bow and arrow ready and pointed it at the caribou. He waited for the caribou to walk in sideways. As the caribou moved in sideways, he still didn't release his arrow. The moment he was going to fire, the caribou shouted to the boy, "Oh, don't shoot me. Yet, I want to talk to you first." The caribou was talking to him. Then he decided not to release his arrow. It was a young female caribou, and it came right close to him and said to the boy, "Will you marry me?" The boy was surprised to hear that and wondered how he could marry a caribou. And the caribou said again, "Will you marry me?" The boy said to the caribou, "How could I marry you? If I marry you, I will freeze to death. You don't make fire, you live outside, you don't drink water." The caribou girl said to the boy, "You won't get cold, you won't get thirsty, and you won't eat snow. You will feel just the right way you feel when you're inside the tent. It's warm and the fire is in there. If you marry me, you will live the same way as you live today." The boy couldn't agree with her. He said to the caribou girl, "How could I marry you? You don't use snowshoes. I won't be able to walk in the deep snow as you do. I won't be able to run as fast as you do. You're much faster than I am. If I marry you and you feel there's danger close by, like if the people are after us, you will take off and run fast and I'll be left behind. What would happen to me if I can't run?" The caribou girl said to the boy, "What you just said is not going to happen. You will live as you always have lived. Look at the herd there. You see them as they are outside, but all of them are inside, and the fire is there too. You will do everything like you do in your own tent." The boy was nervous and scared because the caribou girl pressured him to marry her. Never happens. The caribou girl once again said to the boy, "If you marry me, you will see me as a human girl, although you see me as a caribou at the moment." And the caribou girl also said to the boy, "If you marry me, I will dress like a human girl, and I will wear snowshoes too. You will always see me as the girl. Right now, you see me as the caribou. Don't look at me for a while and then turn around." When the boy turned his head and look at her, he saw her as a human girl, well-dressed with snowshoes and moccasins. She looked very pretty to him, and he fell in love with her instantly. But he still didn't know what to do. He couldn't make up his mind. And the caribou girl said to the boy, "Look at me now. This is what I will always going to do and live like a human girl." The boy said to the caribou girl, "What's going to happen to me if a pack of wolves chase you? I'll be left behind and I'll lose you because I can't run as fast as you do. I won't be able to eat the snow and I'll starve to death." The caribou girl said, "No, you will not starve to death. What you see now is a human girl. That's what I'll always be. You will have the same food as you have always had in your home." The boy then agreed with her and said, "Okay, I'll marry you." And the boy couldn't help it because he was in love with her now. The caribou came closer to him and said, "Take off your snowshoes, leave your bow and arrow here, and your leather shawl." And the caribou girl's brother was with the herd, and his name was Umechushkush. He went to see it and listened to what his sister had to say. And the brother said, "If the boy marries your sister, come back and run in a winding way." The boy and the caribou went down the hill. He saw her again as a caribou. The caribou girl told the boy, "Follow me and try to step in every step I make." The boy felt he had no problem walking without snowshoes. When the brother knew that his sister had married the caribou, he took off and ran in a winding way. And the other caribou said, "The brother is on his way and he runs the way we asked him to run. Maybe his sister married that boy." One of the male caribou got scared and sat up and watched them coming. He stood up and defecated over all the ice. He was so scared. The father of the caribou girl said, "Sit down, my son-in-law will be afraid of you." And when the big caribou sat down again, the boy and the caribou girl came closer. And the big caribou just looked at them coming. The boy was wondering why where he was going to stay when he was there. And as they came closer, the boy thought he saw a tent with firewood at the door and boughs inside. It was a tent, all right. As the Caribou girl entered the doorway, he saw her hand opening the door. And when he first saw Caribou, they were outside, sitting on the ice. Both the boy and the Caribou went inside. The tent was big, and there was a big crowd inside. The Caribou girl just kept moving until she reached where she was sleeping, and then she sat down. The tent was really the same as the boy's father's tent, and the boy sat there too. He just sat on the floor listening to the girl's father telling old stories. There was a big crowd in the tent, and one of the older Caribou said to the other, "Grandfather, old man, give him something to drink." I'm going to stop the story here because this story is a very long one. But as you can tell, there's more to this story than the simple story of a boy falling in love with a caribou. There's science, there's knowledge, there's ethics, there's approach, there's respect, there's responsibility. And this story for us, for the Innu people, really solidifies the sacred agreement that we have with caribou. And the fact that really we are one with caribou. There is no difference between us and caribou. And so why does this matter? Well, I'm from the Quebec-Labrador Peninsula, and our caribou is in trouble. Our caribou herds were once the largest in the world, at nearly 1 million in the early 1990s, and we're just awaiting the last census results, but they're at less than 9,000 today. And so for us, how are we going to maintain our identity and our culture in an era of disappearance and impact? That's why it matters so much. And that's why what Danica and Eli had to contribute and did the work they did at the ICE process is so important, and why we were so pleased to support that work in any way and to continue the legacy as best we can now that the report is there and the recommendations are there. And finally, just the last comment, because I know I'm running a butt on my time here. Stories always do that. Is that, all of caribou right across northern Canada is now either listed or recommended to be listed under the Species at Risk Act. I think in terms of a driver for the achievement of the targets under Target 1, and in fact all of the targets under the CBD, that reality is going to be an important reality to account for and to look to in terms of development of solutions for the achievement of the target, and really the protection of the species, and ultimately the protection of people like mine, the Innu. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Val. So we have 15 minutes. I'm wondering if anybody from the audience would like to ask a question of any of our panel members. Please do feel free to make your way up to the microphones. I realize that's not the best structure. And we'll have a few opportunities to engage with this group of amazing leaders.
Hello, thank you. I'm Anna Porzakansky from the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation.
Hi.
And thank you so much for all your interventions and presentations. I learned a lot. I can't help but be curious, Eli, about how your story continues. I really want to know what happened when they had that meal together, and what happened after. Can you tell us a little bit? I really want to know. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Well, actually, they did not accept the invitation. But something else happened at that time, which was quite beautiful and transformative for the region, is that there were people from the village of Tofino, non-Indigenous peoples, who came and camped out with our people, and through that experience of many weeks together out on the land, relationships were formed that weren't there before. And then, essentially, like there's myself and many others who are, product of that international, it was the hippie days, make love, not war, and all the rest of it. My mom was a blue-eyed, blonde-haired girl from the prairies, and like many who went out to the West Coast, interacted, and I have now 3 generations of that side of my family in Tofino. And so the beautiful thing that emerged from that, and over time we did come to some reconciliation with the logging community on the West Coast. It's still 34 years later, still developing those relationships. But together, the newcomers, the non-Indigenous peoples from Tofino and New Channel peoples raised funds to essentially get an injunction. There was several injunctions that were launched at the same time, and 2 of them were held in what is called an interlocutory injunction now. But it took both communities to do that, and so there was something very beautiful that came from that. It wasn't an immediate meal as we had hoped, but yeah. Thanks for the question.
Sergio?
Thank you. I really want to share appreciation for your stories, your time, and the knowledge that you shared throughout the 1 hour that you spoke, mostly about interconnectedness. You presented an answer that I haven't been able to eloquently share, and it's to explain to academics and to non-Indigenous groups why it is important to understand the intersection between environmental justice and social justice. Some people don't get to separate in boxes their work. Some people's lives and cultures and languages depend, and survival depend on the intersection of social and environmental justice. I work for Sierra Club. I was going to say pleasure, but it's not always a pleasure. I work for an organization that works on conservation and has a very troubled history of racism and displacement of Indigenous groups. And working for that organization, it is clear that we are trying to acknowledge our history and move forward into a new way of doing this kind of work, which is understanding that social justice is environmental justice and vice versa. And a lot of people internally at the organization say, why are you talking about people when you're just supposed to be protecting wolves or caribou? And therefore, this is why in an hour you were able to explain why, and I would love the audience to carry that message and understand that it is impossible to separate people from the land or the land from people, and the beautiful birds and bears and things that we like to chase, they are all in the picture, and the sooner we get comfortable with that intersection, the sooner or the better we will advance our conservation efforts. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And this may be the last question, so. Oh, well, okay, maybe.
Don't take too much time.
Well, in a sense, I'm going to disagree with the last speaker and the panel. That I believe that conservation transcends Indigenous people, transcends non-Indigenous people, transcends humans. Because if you look at the very first people who arrived in Hawaii, obviously Indigenous people, wiped out a number of species. And the same thing happened in New Zealand. The Maori, I guess, I forget the name of the bird, but the moa, yeah, wiped out the moa. So what I would like to hear is conservation that transcends humanity. You understand what I'm saying? All humans are the problem. We all have a problem.
Yeah. I think that you have an inner world of disconnectedness, and I think that it's part of the problem. We see humans as the problem, and it reinforces a misconception of ourselves as separate from nature. And I mean, it's fine if you want to continue to live in that world. You know, I think that we need all kinds of different perspectives and people to make life interesting. But like you say, we disagree. Maybe, do you want to take a stab at?
Sure. I think that approach now, in the time in history in which we find ourselves, is a fairly neat way of sort of silencing some of those dark histories. And the fact that Indigenous peoples were forcibly displaced, Indigenous peoples were criminalized for exercising their lifeways vis-a-vis their traditional lands and territories, and even our spiritual connection to the natural world, Mother Earth, to animals, plants, etc., was pretty much outlawed, even in Canadian law, for example. And so to say that it's something that doesn't have much to do with people is in a sense sort of a rejection of the reality of those dark histories. It's a rejection of the fact that of the different worldviews that Indigenous peoples bring to relation to Mother Earth. And I think I do kind of understand where you're coming from in the sense that it's what you're describing is sort of maybe one approach that's been taken to address the fact that for the settler society, so those who came from Europe and those who settled in the United States and Canada, those folks have often taken a very utilitarian approach to Mother Earth, saying, what use is Mother Earth to me? How does this benefit me? And so in Canada, we have had for decades a staples economy, right? So it's like our entire, wealth as a country is built off natural resources and the destruction of Mother Earth, essentially, logging, oil and gas development, now fracking, all of this stuff. Has really been what has built the wealth of these North American countries. And I think to sort of take this approach that that conservation transcends people is actually, it's a good way of wiping out humans altogether, and it's a good way of like wiping out maybe some of those approaches and methodologies. But I think what it does also is it does both the good and the bad. So it takes away the bad in the sense that it takes away this sort of this sense of entitlement to Mother Earth as a resource for profit for this sort of monolith capitalist and consumerist systems that we're all a part of. But it also, would obliterate, the cultural and spiritual and, the way that we've lived with the natural world forever, as far as our oral histories go and our oral narratives. And I think part of what also needs to be understood is that for us, the fact that we've survived everything that's happened to us and the fact that we've survived things that have happened to our lands and territories and waters, is essentially a bit of a miracle in and of itself. I was spending some time with elders from Musqueam recently, and one of the elders, John Cryer, said, just imagine your ancestors 200 years ago when, we were on the chopping block, so to speak, our, first governments here in Canada had the stated intention of basically annihilating us, essentially, and certainly that happened in the States as well, but with more vigor. And so, he said, think of the vision that your ancestors had to have for you to survive. And think of how powerful that is that you're here as evidence of that. Now think of if we worked collectively on a new vision for our future, What do we want to see for our children? What do we want to see for our peoples, for our culture, for our language, for what we hold dear and what we want to see held dear for future generations? And I don't think it's going to happen with a sort of an artificial, separation of ourselves from the world. We have to learn to live with water as an entity, as a being, that has a spirit. That's not just something to be utilized for our benefit, or that's somehow just a utility or something that helps us as human beings. Where the concept is not supremacy of people, right? The concept is living together. And that, the title of our report is We Rise Together. We didn't mean just people, right? And I'm sorry if that sort of came across in my talk, because I meant to address that too, and I'm glad you raised this point. Because We Rise Together is about us rising up and collaboratively, cooperatively living together, not just as people, but in environment as well. I work a lot on water, and a lot of people that I work with, including non-Indigenous organizations, talk about reconciliation as a useful concept for just how we are as peoples vis-a-vis water. And how we are as peoples vis-a-vis mountains and different discrete ecosystems. I think that, and understanding how do we elevate the role of those natural caretakers. In Alberta, our beaver population has been decimated by trapping and the use of recreational vehicles, frankly. And they are the ones who care for our wetlands. They are an integral part of our water management system. And science recognizes that. And Indigenous peoples recognize that. So how do we work together to elevate the role of the beaver, to have the beaver be recognized and respected? I think that's part of it.
I just want to add a couple things quickly, because I think the question, and I want to thank you for disagreeing. It reminds me of all of our gatherings, because on every gathering, there was always one dissenting voice on the first night. And it always led to something really great in the Four Moose narrative. But you raise, I think, a really important point that, because it's connected to this idea that overpopulation is the number one problem on the earth. And I think it's a very dangerous, it's actually a very dangerous idea. If you look at, there's all kinds of new statistics that are coming out about the amount of food that's wasted in North America every year. The military spending of the United States of America alone could end world poverty at probably 2 or 3 times. The military spending of the G8 or the G7 could transform, if we invested our collective intellectual, financial wealth into making this planet a better place. It's not overpopulation. That's an easy excuse to turn a blind eye to genocide and famine. I think that's why it's so dangerous.
I just want to give Val a few more minutes just to answer that, and then I'll answer that question, and then we'll break for lunch.
All right. I'm on. Good. The only other comment that I'd add is that there was recently a study released that demonstrated that over a third of the world's remaining biodiversity is located on Indigenous lands. And so if we're going to have a solution globally to the global challenges that all humanity faces, it means working with Indigenous peoples as Indigenous peoples on the lands as who they are. And so I think that's really important. And the other thing is we all as people have collective human stewardship responsibilities that are important to upheld, and that concept of responsibility to me is one that we've been advancing more and more, because this isn't about, what science recommends A, B, C, D. This is about our collective future on this planet. If there is no Canada, there is no Canadians. If there's no Canadians, then there's no Canadian economies, sciences, concepts, and theories. And so just as a passionate response is work with us or suffer your peril.
Thank you very much. Oh. Is it short?
Very short. It's
All
not a
right.
question either. I thought I would get up and introduce myself. Nistu Agok Natawalkaki. I'm from the Blood Tribe in southern Alberta, and I am a beaver woman. And that means that we come from the descendants of the beaver people, and that is our oldest bundle. And the reason we have that bundle is because one day, as in the story narrative, a couple living near a water body, the man would go off in the morning and come back late every day, leaving his wife alone very often. And one day, this woman was visited by a man, but he was actually a beaver. And so they spent the winter together, and one day that man came back, the human, and found that his wife was gone. And so what happened was he cried and he followed her tracks, and they led to the water, but there was no back tracks. It ended at the water, and he wept and wept and wept. And the beaver took pity on this man, but the reason he took his wife was because this man was over trophy hunting. So I would comment that yes, we come from this, and we're ancient, and we have a beaver bundle today because that beaver made a treaty with this human, and he called Ganamyanistipik, all the animals, all the birds, the water beings, Suyipik, the ones that live in the water, anybody who wanted to gift this man. Today was the day to gift this man. And so today we honor that treaty. As a beaver woman, when I smudge in the morning, I'm renewing treaty back to that time. And so when we open our bundle in the spring, that's when the waters thaw. And when we close it, it's before it freezes. So we honor those cycles. We learn the hard way, but we remember it, our collective memory. So this is something that I wanted to share, that, coming from southern Alberta as a Blackfoot woman, our territory goes to the North Saskatchewan River, down to the Yellowstone, along the Rocky Mountains, into the Sand Hills. But I was also told that we come right over to the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border, and that we traded at the Forks, or the Assiniboine and the Red River. So we had an expansive territory, which came also from the buffalo. But our oldest bundle, in a week, I'm going to go set up camp. As soon as I land, my flight lands, I'm going to drive to camp and set up my teepee. I'm part of our lead society, which is Itzkanaiks. And again, we're going to renew that relationship that goes back a long time. We're not perfect, but we keep ourselves on the ground. We don't sit on chairs. Our elders laugh at us if we bring in metal. We're not allowed to bring in metal. Only one staff can have metal. So that's how low we keep ourselves, right next to the ground. That's our relationship. It gets hard for 4 days, fasting, people coming in, we paint. It's a big responsibility. But these are things that we take seriously, and we sure take conservation seriously, which means that we take what we need and we don't waste. And so this is what I hear in terms of food waste. This is a very core thing. It's maybe, conservation science is really big, and I am a scientist, but at the same time, I live our traditional knowledge. I live it. It's a lived way of life. We live it. And so this is something that I wanted to share, and thank you for giving me this time.
Thank you.
The moderator.
Thank you, Paulette. Sorry if I rushed you. So our panel is around. Please feel free to talk to them for a little while over lunch. And thank you again for joining us today about Indigenous-led conservation.